Welcome to another edition of the Energy Week Podcast. Ryan Ray running solo today as Dr. Energy is across the pond, so be sure to check out all that she's doing at the, I think it's the Atlantic Council Forum, so we'll link to her Twitter in the show notes. Today, though, we have a special episode. We are talking China, and I have on some friends of mine from the Bush-China Foundation, more properly, the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. I have on the President and CEO, David Firestein, and Robbin Goodman, the Director of Business Programs and Corporate Affairs. Robbin, you've been on before. David, I believe this is your first appearance. How's it going today, gentlemen?
It's going great, Ryan. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan, for having us. Doing really well.
So, I got to think about this show, and, it was just a few months ago I saw you, David, and Robbin, I saw you more recently, but you guys awarded me and several other my teammates as basically a China expert. So I had planned on interviewing you guys, but do y'all want to ask me questions, or how do you think this would work out best?
Absolutely. That sounds great to me, Ryan. I've got a list of about 25, 30 questions I'd like to go through with you because, believe me, I could benefit from your insight.
We'll save that for another time. So let's just, I have some specific questions I do want to go through, but there was news over the weekend. China is sending over a representative to sign the Phase 1 trade deal. Take us back. Let's just kind of give a quick recap from y'all's standpoint of, obviously kind of the short timeline when this started, where we're at today. They say they're going to sign it this week. Do we think that's actually going to happen? Anything that we might want to look for as a bump in the road that could prevent this? And then we'll talk about what's actually inside of Phase 1 after that.
Ryan, thanks so much. Maybe I'll start, and then Robbin can come in as well. This has been an issue that we've been working on very intensively at the Bush-China Foundation now for many months, and even predating our time at the foundation. Robbin and I have been engaged very actively on this issue. Just in terms of kind of the basic backstory, Donald Trump campaigned very heavily on the notion that the United States was getting the short end of the stick when it came to trade with China. And he certainly gave expression to a lot of the frustration that was out there in the U.S. business community about things like intellectual property theft and technology transfer regimes in China, state subsidies, industrial policy, and a host of other issues. And in year one in the White House, the Trump administration had a whole bunch of other things going on and didn't really bear down on this issue. But starting very shortly after that first year was over, the Trump administration started focusing very intensively on the issue of trade with China. And in the spring of 2018, almost 2 years ago, really started ramping up the administration's efforts to try to bring China to the table to deal with some of the perceived, from a U.S. perspective, unfairnesses in the system, inequities in the system, problems from a U.S. vantage, and so on. And the preferred tool that President Trump decided to lean on very heavily was the idea of levying tariffs on an increasingly large swath of Chinese imports into the United States. And over a period of about a year and a half, or certainly a year, the administration ended up levying tariffs on just about the entirety of goods and services coming from China into the United States. In many cases going up to as high as 25% and threatening to go even higher. And as a result, today, the overwhelming majority, nearly all, in fact, of Chinese goods and services that come into the United States are basically under an average of about a 21% tariff. And of course, that's meant higher costs and prices for U.S. consumers. And we could discuss that in detail. But the bottom line is those tariffs have gone into effect. And starting in the latter part of 2018 and all through 2019, there's been a series of efforts on the part of the United States and China to sit down together and see if we can get to a better place in the trade relationship. Of course, in response to the U.S. tariffs, the Chinese put on their own retaliatory tariffs and made it more expensive for Chinese consumers to buy American goods and services. And as a result, both sides ended up losing quite a bit. Any objective measure would suggest that consumers on both sides are paying higher prices. Jobs have been hit. In the United States, farmers in particular have been hit very hard, but others as well. And from a U.S. perspective, nonpartisan assessments have concluded that U.S. consumers or U.S. households are now paying perhaps $1,500 a year more in terms of prices for things relative to where we were before the trade war began. So the bottom line is it's hit everybody to one degree or another. And so to come to your point, Ryan, I think what we've seen now is that the U.S. administration and the Chinese government have sat down and, at least theoretically, agreed to what has been referred to as a phase one trade deal, which will be signed formally on Wednesday of this week, on January 15. And we can talk more about that, but at least it represents, if nothing else, a kind of symbolic movement toward a more constructive phase of discussions, and we can kind of parse what we think is in the agreement, talk about that. But at least there is some movement forward, and I think a recognition on both sides that the trade war just going on unabated is not good for anybody. It's not good for anybody economically. It's not good for consumers on either side. And from a political standpoint, it's certainly not good for President Trump because a lot of his constituents are being hit the hardest by what essentially is a tax increase that he has levied on them via the vehicle of tariffs. So that's kind of where things are. And all of us hope that the situation will get better. A lot of us, Robbin and myself and our foundation and many others, have worked to try to do our part to help the two sides get to a better place to the degree that we can as a nonprofit. And that continues to be a very important priority for our foundation.
Okay, so let's a couple things there for just to go back on. You talked about the IP theft issue. Two things that kind of I would like to get your opinion on as well is one, President Trump talks about China devaluing their currency, and two, the so-called trade deficit. Now, obviously, if you look at what our Fed does with its currency, you could make an argument that it devalues our own currency. So walk us through, is what China does with its currency different than what our Federal Reserve does? Is it at a larger scale? Is it one-to-one? So what's going on with that argument? And then two, how do you think about a trade deficit? Because there's certain ways you could think about trade and go, well, okay, yeah, you're buying less from me, but I don't have what you need. So is that what's going on? Or is it no, that they're willfully buying products not from America despite America? Unpack that for us, please.
Well, great questions, Ryan. And just a couple of thoughts here. One, so let me touch on the question of deficits first. President Trump and candidate Donald Trump, before he became president, was very focused and I would say fixated on the concept of deficits. And for him, that was the measure or the metric that he applied to establish that not only that the trade relationship was fundamentally unfair, which was his principal argument, but also that, in fact, China was, in his words, perpetrating the greatest theft in the history of humanity on the United States by virtue of the fact that there was a trade deficit. The first thing I want to say about that, and there are a lot of things that one can and should say about this topic of the deficit, but the first thing I want to say is probably the most important. Under President Trump's policies, the U.S. trade deficit with China is higher today than it has ever been in history. So if his goal, and that's according to his own Department of Commerce, by the way, so if his goal was to reduce the deficit by any objective measure, and certainly by the measure of President Trump's Department of Commerce, we have failed to attain that goal. So we actually have a larger deficit today with China, at least in goods and merchandise, than we've ever had. More broadly, we also have a larger trade deficit with the world than we have had dating back to July 4th, 1776, according to President Trump's Department of Commerce. So the deficit numbers are going in the wrong direction. which is, raises the interesting question of, if this is the solution, then maybe we ought to go back to the problem because we have a solution now that's actually worse than the problem that the Trump administration identified. There are a lot of reasons that the United States has a deficit with China. One of those reasons is that China does, in fact, play the game unfairly from an American perspective. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. From an American perspective, and I think from a world perspective, in terms of many of the other countries that trade with China, it would be fair to say that, yes, China does game the system. Yes, China does things that are not in compliance with the norms of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and so forth and so on. All of that is true, but that's not the only reason or even the primary reason why the deficit is what it is. Tax policy in the United States is another consideration. The valuation of the dollar and the valuation of the renminbi, to which you alluded, are other very important factors. But most fundamentally, just from a pure economic theory standpoint, and this is, again, nonpartisan stuff. This is stuff that economists have always agreed on. And that is that when you have a country whose consumption outweighs its savings, structurally and inherently, you're going to have a deficit. And so we have a deficit for that reason. We consume more than we save. We use our national credit card, if you will, to live beyond our means. That's why we have a deficit. Up until the point at which that changes, we will always have a deficit with the world. The deficit will either be with China or Vietnam or Bangladesh or pick your country. But for the most part, we will have deficits with many of our trading partners because of that very fundamental imbalance in our economy. So all of these reasons point to the reason why the particular approach that the Trump administration has utilized has not done what President Trump has expressed the hope that it would do. In fact, it's had the opposite effect precisely because there are some underlying reasons that are much more fundamental than the existing unfairnesses that are present in the U.S.-China trade relationship. Those do exist. That's real. But that's a very small piece of the puzzle, or at least it's not the only piece of the puzzle. There are a lot of other reasons why the deficit is the way it is. And I think that's overlooked in a lot of the political discourse. So the other thing I would just quickly say with respect to your point about currency is that, yes, China has done some things with the management of its own currency to offset some of the impact of the tariffs, and that's certainly its prerogative. Many countries would do a similar thing if faced with these kinds of punitive tariffs. And likewise, certain things that the United States has done, such as the significant tax cut of December 2017 that President Trump signed into law, that generated more money to some degree in the pockets and bank accounts of Americans. They then took that money and went and bought imported goods disproportionately from China. And so in a certain sense, again, policies on both sides, including currency policy, taxation policy, and other considerations, have contributed to the deficit and contributed now, along with tariffs, to the deficit going in the wrong direction, even by President Trump's own standards.
Okay.
Hey, Ryan,
yeah, go ahead.
Robbin here, if I could elaborate real quickly on one very good point that David was making in regards to the idea of a trade balance. We did some original research and took a look at the trade numbers and the general idea, as you pointed out, of the trade balance and what it means. And this goes all the way back to President Trump, at the time, candidate Trump's his race for presidency and some of the things that he was talking about. And David pointed out that, if you look at the trend where we're going, we have the largest trade deficit both with China as with the world than we ever have in the history of the U.S. And so when we measure that, we talk about trade deficit, but we also talk about trade balance. And so we took a look at, the idea of a trade balance as, okay, if I buy $1 from you, you buy $1 from me, then that should be a 1-to-1. If I buy $2 from you and you buy $2 from me, well, that's a 2-to-1. That's balance, right? That's how we think about it. But we so often put these numbers out there. If we say it's 300 billion, we say it's 600 billion, whatever the number is, we don't have a relative scale to the total trade that's being done. And so when we looked at it, in the last time we had balanced trade, as in a 1-to-1, I sold $1 to you, sold $1 to me, was 1985. And we sold $6 billion of goods to China, and China sold roughly $6 billion worth of goods to us. Ever since then, even to today, ever since then, our trade balance went up. It went up from 1-to-1 all the way until the early 2000s. In 1999, it was 624 to 1 and 618 to 1 in 2000. That represented the highest trade imbalance that we had, meaning that we bought $6.24 worth of goods and they bought $1 worth of goods of ours. Since then, it has gone down, it's gone back up, it's gone down, but the overall trend was going down all the way into 2013, 2014. We got down to our lowest in that decade at $3.62. $3. That means we bought $3.60 worth of goods, and they sold, and we sold $1 worth of goods. And it stayed right around then. And starting in 2016, it was at $4, and then 2017 and 2018, all the way up into last year. We don't yet have December data, but calculating for last year, you look at the period of time within the trade war and the new tariff policy being in effect. Actually, we lost about 10 years worth of balancing of trade. We went from what I talked to, that $3.62, and then in 2016, when President Trump was elected, $3.89. We actually jumped up to $4.48, and last year was $4.28, not including December. And so if you look in true balance, that goes all the way back into the early 2008 was the last time we were this imbalanced. And so not just from a total number standpoint, we're now doing less business with China. We're now doing, we're now selling less goods. We're actually creating a less balanced trade relationship with China, just utilizing the numbers that come off of the Department of Commerce's website, their foreign trade numbers. There you can find that we are actually less balanced in trade with China than we were previous to this administration, and the trend has reversed itself. We were getting more balanced, and now we're getting less.
And Ryan, if I may, I just want to say, I want to just commend Robbin for the terrific analysis that he has done over these months in the very area that he just mentioned. And I want to just kind of make one point to amplify the really good point that Robbin made. If you go to a friend and say, I paid $10,000 for a car, and say, well, did I get good value? The friend can't answer that question unless he knows what car you got for the $10,000. And Robbin makes a really, really good point that just to talk about the $365 billion a year budget or trade deficit that we had with China in the absence of any context is a meaningless discussion by definition for the really good reasons that Robbin laid out. And looking at that proportionality and that relativity of how much are we buying for how much are they buying is a really important element of this discussion that has largely been overlooked. And I give a lot of credit to Robbin for bringing that element into the analysis and having that inform a lot of the work that we've done to try to advocate for policies that are better for America and better for American shareholders, workers, farmers, and ranchers than the policies that we see at present. So I just want to highlight that for you as well.
Okay, lovely. Let's put some meat on that bone then. Let's look at what's going to happen with the Phase 1 trade deal. The last time I've looked around, at least it seems the media is saying that no one's seen the Phase 1 trade deal. So let's take it from what's been talked publicly, what you've guys seen. What do we anticipate from the Phase 1 trade deal, assuming the administrations will release it when it comes out? If maybe it's been released and I missed it, but what do we anticipate? And then how hard are these numbers in a trade deal like this? So if it says $40 billion, will we expect to see basically $40 billion change hands from buying of goods and services through the trade deal, or is it a symbolic number that just means we're going to buy a lot of stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ryan. Let me take a first crack at that. The short answer is, as of this moment, as we speak right now, there's no legally binding commitment on any side to do anything. So there hopefully will be a signing of a document on Wednesday, but it's not as if it's a treaty that has the force of law or, something that is certain to be done, by the letter of the document. I think inherently it represents a kind of political commitment. Arguably, it represents a commitment on each side to do certain things. But I think it's also understood that sometimes commitments are not followed through on. And obviously, the hope is that a commitment will be followed through on, and each side will implement its responsibilities under the commitment, under the agreement in good faith. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes on these matters, it doesn't happen. I was part of the U.S. delegation in a junior role at the time in 1996 when we had the first landmark agreement between the United States and China on intellectual property rights. 24 years later, we're still struggling with the issues that ostensibly were largely settled 24 years ago. So I don't think there's any inherent guarantee, while we wish success for the process, because all of us want to see us get past this trade war, which is costing America so much, and for that matter, also costing Chinese consumers. But that said, I wouldn't hold my breath. I think a lot is going to be borne out over a period of weeks and months, and really months and probably years, before we can assess how effective this deal is. Nothing has been published to date, as far as I'm aware, as far as the details of the agreement. That's been one of the criticisms that have been leveled about it is, there's not a lot of excitement about this agreement for a number of reasons, but one is because most people don't feel like they don't understand what the agreement is and what it asks China to do, and what it requires China and the United States to do for their respective commitments. So I think it's a question mark. I think it's overall positive that this signing will occur in a couple of days. I think it may augur well for future discussions about how to resolve some of the more difficult issues. But what we do know about what's referred to as the Phase 1 trade deal. And by the way, I just want to comment on the nomenclature because I think it's important. It almost makes it sound like there's some grand plan here. Like someone said right at the beginning, we're going to do a Phase 1, and then after that, we're going to do a Phase 2, and after that, we're going to do a Phase 3, and there will be 16 sections for each, and so on. It wasn't like that. The reason that the idea of a Phase 1 trade deal came up is that it's fancy nomenclature for we didn't come anywhere close to resolving the issues we were trying to resolve, so we better report something, some progress, some deliverable, and let's call it Phase 1 and make it sound like we had this all planned out. But in reality, it's kind of a piece of the puzzle, but the larger and more difficult pieces are still out there, and they're not part of this agreement. But what this agreement would do, if it's implemented, is presumably prompt the Chinese to purchase tens of billions, perhaps 50 billion, or over some period of years more in agricultural commodities from the United States, such as soybeans and other agricultural produce. And it will help, above all, the farmers by getting China to purchase significant quantities of these commodities. In other words, to put it a different way, what Phase 1 will do is take us back part of the way to where we were before any of this started in the first place, except that it doesn't take us all of the way back. So it's kind of partially undoing the damage that has been inflicted on the U.S. economy by the administration. And, that's kind of what Phase 1 essentially does. What it doesn't do is address in significant ways intellectual property, technology-related issues, which is a very profound area in the U.S.-China trade relationship. and the U.S.-China relationship generally. It doesn't address state subsidies in China. It does not address industrial policy. And there's a lot of things, the hard things, that are not addressed in the Phase 1 trade deal. So I hope it's successful. I hope it works. I hope the Chinese buy more of our farmers' products. And they may well do that to some degree. We'll find out over time how effective this is. But there's a lot of, I would say, a lot of question marks out there as to whether Phase 2, quote unquote, is going to happen. Because the reason Phase 2 is not in the Phase 1 deal in the first place is because the so-called Phase 2 issues are vastly much more difficult and complex than just getting China to do what it was doing before the trade war started and purchasing American agricultural commodities. So that's where we are. The last thing I would say about this from my vantage is just that we've, in a sense, seen this story before. I coined a phrase and said that this is a little bit like Groundhog Day in terms of the U.S.-China trade relationship. This deal has been announced a bunch of different times over the last year in one way or another, sometimes with different nomenclature and different language. But the idea that the U.S. administration had somehow pressured China successfully to commit to buying more agricultural goods, we've seen that headline 5 or 6 times in the last 12 to 16 months. And this is the latest of those. The fact that it didn't happen every time before suggests that we ought to be cautious about what to expect this time. But, we've seen this story before. My hope is that this time we'll start going down a more productive and constructive path to get us back to a footing that is better for America and also better for the trade relationship in the world than what we see right now.
So let me ask this. This might be a quicker way to put some of this cap on the Phase 1 deal. Obviously, we're in a presidential election year. You have the primaries getting ready to kick off for the Democrats, and we know Iowa is first up. So getting the Phase 1 trade deal done for Trump's perspective is important, probably for not getting too many voters wooed over to the other side, if you will, during primary season. But then Ellen and I were talking before the break, and Robbin and I talked offline. He was kind of filling in some of these gaps for me. I understand with all the caveats you put on it, we still got to plant the seed, we got to grow the product, we got to harvest it. Even if everyone does their best and follows this out to the tune of however much dollars it is, it's probably going to take a little while before you actually see these results. You're kind of alluding to that earlier. But the other thing is, that's with the ag side maybe, but the other thing is there's reports out of China about they're really struggling on the with pork, was it the African swine flu, I think, what's going on there. So might you see a little bit more long drawn out process with corn or soybean or something like that, but then if there's some pork trade involved, that might be a little bit more immediate impact, or is it still too early to tell about that as well?
Well, hey, Ryan.
Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, maybe I could tackle this real quickly in just two quick points. I'm sure David has quite a lot to share on this, but one thing that you pointed out, and that you and Dr. Weld have been very diligent in pointing out, is the political aspect of the trade deal, and that's really important. And I would add, to take a look currently. So Donald Trump is actually scheduled to be down in Austin, Texas. I'm here in Dallas. David's actually in Austin. He'll be down here on Sunday, this next Sunday, following this week where he's supposed to sign this trade deal, and he'll be addressing the annual convention of the American Farm Bureau. Just looking at the kind of constituents that he's going to directly after working on these deals, it's no doubt that there is a aspect of this that is trying to tailor something to give them a ray of hope or a ray of sunshine to say that China will be able to start purchasing goods. And there's a lot of question marks about the composition of the goods that they'll be purchasing, as well as the total amount. And you look at historical data where there's only been 26 billion worth of goods is the highest amount that China ever consumed of U.S. agricultural goods. And so over the last 2 years, that's largely been decimated in a real decimated term, utilizing that it's gone down by enormous numbers, could be near 90%, just essentially stopping those purchases. So maybe that 40 to 50 billion number that's thrown out there by the president himself and his administration is keyed to the losses that were incurred and forward-looking statement saying, okay, well, now those will be brought back. However, those losses can never truly be brought back, because even if it is doubled to 50 billion, well, they would have normally already purchased 26 billion for this calendar year. So you're still in a huge deficit. So however this is bore out, the numbers do not work. And the farmers, I myself am a rancher and I come from a farming family, and, they live and die by that spreadsheet. And by the cost of the corn, cost of the seeds, by the cost of oil, of crude oil going into diesel. They have to purchase diesel to run the tractor. We all know about this, and that's how it gets so much into the energy industry. Is that the profit margins for our farmers are at a historical low. Many of them are losing money. Many of them are shutting down their farms, and they won't be able to get the capital back and outlay more. And so right now, for the ones that are hanging on, that's just what they're looking to do, to hang on. And so they'll take any ray of sunshine into that. And then you asked about the composition. It's a great point that you brought up about, China traditionally, and about half of all of their agricultural imports of the U.S. was soybeans. And part of that is direct to soy products like tofu, like other products that they will that their citizens eat and their consumers buy. But a very large portion of that goes into their meat industry, and they have for a long time had a very substantial pork production, and that through the flu that has gone around has caused their true need for soybeans to go down, having their pork industry be hit by that disease. But I would also point out that there are other areas that they can make up for this. And I'm not saying they can get to 40 or $50 billion worth of agriculture goods, but there are other areas that they have been growing in their import. And that, for example, is beef. After a 14-year hiatus, they started importing beef only just a couple of years back, maybe 4 years back. And it's already $1 billion industry just exporting beef to China. So there are many opportunities for U.S. farmers, U.S. agriculture producers to sell to China. But what they're looking for is not one-time purchases. They're looking for long-term market access and stability. That's how you're able to know what to plant year after year, because you know the market, and you don't have to be thinking what is on the minds of the politicians and how are they going to utilize politics and bad policy to try to weasel something through. No, you're thinking about how do I be the most efficient grower? How do I grow the best products? How do I get my products marketed the best, transporting them? You're thinking about all of these other things that go into agriculture production. But unfortunately, right now, they're thinking about what's the next trade deal, what's the next policy type thing. And that's not where we've been competitive as a country. We're competitive by opening markets. And so any shine of any light that comes through, ray of hope that says we're going to go into a more open market scenario, then we feel very good, because we know our agricultural producers, our farmers, our ranchers are the best in the world, and they'll be able to compete with the rest of the world if we can get access to those markets.
Okay.
And Ryan, sorry, I just was going to make a quick point, just to add to the very good points that Robbin made, just very briefly. One thing that I think has to be pointed out is that the one area in which the United States had enjoyed a surplus in trade with China was agriculture. And the Trump administration is actually undoing that. So the one area where we sold them more than they sold to us was agriculture. And as Robbin rightly noted, that's now being undone by this administration. A related point is that the administration is now seeking, and has been for the last year and a half, to offset those significant losses, in some cases devastating losses to farming families and farmers and folks that make a living from those products. President Trump has sought to offset that by giving subsidies to farmers. So another way to say that is that President Trump has asked farmers to stop selling to the market and instead start accepting a government handout. In other words, he's paying farmers an income they don't need with money that our nation doesn't have. And that's not a path to success over the long haul. A third point I just want to briefly make is that President Trump has often stated, and factually incorrectly, as has been noted by his own advisors and many others, that, quote, China is paying the tariffs. They're not. We are. We, the American people, American consumers, are, by definition, paying and absorbing the costs of those tariffs. Those costs come to American taxpayers. But the point, and American consumers specifically, the point that I want to make is, if you have the factually mistaken view that the other side is paying the tariffs, then that's going to lead you to policy positions based on that mistaken or fallacious assumption. And that's what we're seeing, is that this president doesn't, and I don't mean it in a negative sense, except just factually, he truly does not seem to understand who pays for these tariffs. And that's taken him down a particular course. And that leads to the last point, which is politics. It's absolutely true that the politics of this issue are such that Trump can either be a two-term president or he can be a tariff president, but he cannot be both. And if he doesn't stop the trade war, and particularly the major hit that's being inflicted on farmers across our country, but disproportionately in the states that he needs to win to be a two-term president, he is going to lose. His margins in states like Wisconsin and other heartland states were very slim, often in the tens of thousands of votes out of millions cast. And if he wins 99% of all the people that voted for him last time stick with him and vote for him this time, he will lose the presidential election, because he will not have the margins in states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and elsewhere, states that he won by a cumulative total of just tens of thousands of votes. If you lose even 1% of your popular vote, for example, because of the tariffs and the impact that they're having on farmers, you don't win a second term as president. So to your point, Ryan, I do think that the politics of the issue are very much prompting President Trump to show some progress. But what he doesn't realize, perhaps, is that then gives China a huge amount of leverage over President Trump. They can decide whether Trump is a one-term president or a two-term president by the way that they react to these policies. And again, I don't think that's necessarily a great thing for the United States to have a foreign country essentially dictating the outcome of our election because of the leverage they have over this important issue, which plays out a certain way electorally and politically. So there are a lot of interlocking issues here that I think you're right to raise questions about. Okay.
I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it. I do want to push back a little bit. I'm not quite sure Trump doesn't understand who pays the tariffs. I think that is possible, of course, because of what he says, but I think it's more likely either A, he believes his base doesn't understand it, or B, he believes his base does understand it, but they don't care because they believe that the long-term benefit will be worth the pain and suffering now. And that's that. I don't want to spend a lot of time debating that, but I do want to make a slight pushback there. I'm not quite sure I would agree with that analysis, but we do got some other stuff to get to. So let's bring it to a little bit more broader discussion here. Let's talk about North Korea, Venezuela, and Iran. To me, when you think about China and U.S., those three countries, I don't know how you can completely separate what's going on in those countries from a Chinese perspective or a U.S. perspective. We both have varying degrees of relationships with these countries. Just kind of quickly walk us through China's relationship with North Korea, with Venezuela, and with Iran. We kind of have a decent idea of what the U.S. relationship is, but from China's perspective, how do they view these three countries?
Well, let me just say a few words about North Korea, and maybe Robbin could come in a little bit also on Venezuela and Iran. I'll just say a couple of things. China looks at the world fundamentally very differently than the United States, than the way we look at the world. Their prism for understanding the world and their role in it is just very different. They see themselves as a great power, but one that is principally interested in its own domestic development and growth, and less actively interested in solving every problem in the world, particularly military and security problems, less interested in putting boots on the ground in various places, etc. So China looks at the world, looks at North Korea, looks at the Middle East and elsewhere through the prism of its own governance imperatives and its desire to have a stable environment within which to grow, to continue to see the Chinese economy expand rapidly, to see Chinese lifted out of poverty. Already a lot of progress has been made over the last 40 years, and there's still plenty of work to do. And that's the way that they see the world. So there's an emphasis on stability. There's an emphasis on not rocking the boat. There's a de-emphasis on military action. There's a de-emphasis on unilateralism. There's a strong emphasis on the United Nations and its role, because China, being a UN permanent member of the Security Council, has veto authority. So by definition, anything the United Nations does will always be acceptable to China, because China will have agreed to it beforehand. And so there's just a very fundamentally different outlook. Let me just say on Korea, North Korea specifically, I think the United States and China do share the same broad goal, which is to see a Korean peninsula that is free of nuclear weapons altogether. But I think the two countries have very different views as to what the best solution is to the problem. I won't dwell on this further. I want to turn the floor over to Robbin to make some points as well. But the one thing I would say about North Korea is that I think both the United States and China have had different assumptions about what would work. And both countries, I think, have been proven wrong for different reasons. China essentially operated from the premise, and continues to operate from the premise, that there is some amount of diplomacy that can be executed that could bring North Korea to the negotiating table and get them to stop pursuing nuclear weapons. I think they're wrong. The United States, I think, thought there and continues to believe there's some amount of sanctions, although this is a little different under President Trump, but historically that there's some amount of sanctions we can bring to bear on North Korea that will coerce them into ceasing and desisting their pursuit of nuclear weapons. We're wrong too. And what's the result of both of those errors in assumption or judgment is that North Korea, I think, is essentially a nuclear weapons state and will become an intercontinental nuclear weapons state on the watch of both the United States and China. It's not any one president's fault or any one leader's fault, but I think both countries and our leaderships have just misgauged North Korea, and I think that we're going to end up seeing a nuclear North Korea with intercontinental capacity, and that's going to be a problem that all of us have to deal with.
Yeah, David, I'll add on that on a prism with which to look at this. One way to see China's view on things often is to look for comparables in the United States and shift the frame and say, okay, how do we view things in the United States? It's not always aligned, but there are many parallels. And one way to think about this that I think, Dr. Wald and Ryan, y'all have been discussing on the podcast, and we discussed this issue in a commercial sense in the last time that I was on about the different deals that China had been doing in both Iran as well as Venezuela, and the signals and the things that the decisions that they're making to pull out of those deals or to stop purchases, and what that means and how they're planning. So to shift into the United States, the way we often look at it is that we call it our backyard policy. The countries that are in Central and South America are in our backyard. And so they are of de facto importance to the security of our nation. And so we've had that, and it's been pervasive throughout, our political sphere, our elite spheres, our congressional delegations have continued to affirm that type of stance on the developments in countries in South America, in Central America. And so, just obviously applying that to the Korean Peninsula, a stable Korean Peninsula, one that is either denuclearized or the nuclear weapons are under some type of predictable kind of a leader that they can work with, that they can deal with, they can help, they can influence, or they can, at least predict actions that they can take, take precautions against a flare-up of either war or other type of tensions of bombs going off. That's good for China. China, if you think about it, you wouldn't want someone who you can't work with, can't predict, can't talk to with nuclear arms in your backyard. And so just in North Korea, it's very easy to see. But applying that same, prism to what's happening in Iran, and the importance of Iran to China, obviously, for the U.S., Iran is a very far away. We have many varied interests in that region, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we've been at war over many of those interests for a long period of time. China has even more interest now because China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is its market access, its plan to gain better logistics between between Europe and China, essentially remaking the Silk Road. That Belt and Road Initiative runs right through Tehran. And so for China, seeing a stable Iran, seeing a stable Afghanistan, seeing a stable Iraq, all those are even more viscerally important to their long-term interests. Now, when we look at the commercial deals that they're doing and whether they decide to stay in these deals or pull out of these deals, a lot of that has to do with the stability, the short, medium, long-term stability of their forecasts of these markets. And I think that is both in Iran as well as in Venezuela right now, with the Maduro administration or regime being on very rocky footing as an investor, as someone's relying on oil markets in Venezuela. You can see how pulling back and taking a less aggressive approach, buying less or sourcing less from that market may be deemed a smart play or an intelligent play if your medium to long-term outlook on the stability of that market and the ability of that market to serve your needs is diminished. And I think that's what we're seeing both in Venezuela and to some degree in Iran, is that there may be less of not necessarily a lack of interest in it as a long-term strategic partner, but in the medium-term forecast, seeing less stability means that they would invest less in that market.
Okay, I know we are.
Yeah, and Ryan, if I may just add one quick data point, Iran currently is around the number 7 supplier of crude oil, for example, to China. So they're pretty significant from an energy standpoint. China certainly has a pretty intense interest in Iran, and then Venezuela is a little lower on the list, around number 9. They supply to China about half the amount of crude that Iran does. They're not inconsequential, but they're not as important as Iran. So the energy piece factors into China's consideration of these geopolitical issues that you're talking about.
Right. Okay. So I know we got about 10 minutes left, so we'll kind of run through these next couple ones. Let's talk about energy. When I was in China just a few months ago, there was some talk about, maybe you can balance the deficit by sending oil or natural gas, LNG, over to China to help balance out the deficit. Is that a reality? Is it too far-fetched? Does China really need it? Are we the best spot to get it from?
So a couple of points on this, and I know Robbin's quite deep on these issues too, but just at a high level, I would just say, I think there really is potential for the United States and China to work together in a way that is truly mutually beneficial. The way I summarize the energy equation is we've got it, they need it, so let's do it. I mean, it's pretty simple in that regard. There's a huge supply just in Texas alone, to say nothing of the rest of the country, of obviously oil, natural gas, but also other types of energy that we can export. China has a huge need for it. They're very reliant on coal even today. They have been around basically two-thirds of their energy consumption has been coal. I think it's down to about 62 or 61%. They're trying to move away from that and toward natural gas, trying to double natural gas consumption in China by 2030, 10 years from now, to go from about 7% of the mix to 15%. We have an incredible abundance of that particular resource, and there ought to be a way to leverage it. We certainly could easily chip away at the deficit just from the standpoint of energy to the tune of anywhere from $100 to $200 billion a year without much difficulty, if the infrastructure were there, if the confidence and the trust were there, if the policy consistency were there, and if there were leadership on both sides that wanted to see this happen. Energy could be the secret sauce, if you will, to really putting a serious dent, or a Texas-sized dent, in the deficit with China from a U.S. standpoint, while giving them something that they desperately need. So I think there's a lot of potential there, but there are definitely some policy challenges that need to be addressed for that commercial activity to occur. And again, Robbin's been very active in that industry and very deep in those areas, as you yourself certainly are, Ryan.
So yeah, let's a couple quick hitters in before I want to talk about kind of the broader vision of the Bush-China Foundation here in a second. So one thing you learn when you start studying China is they've got this mass urbanization plan. They brought, I think it's 400 million people to what they consider above the poverty, into the middle class. I think that number's right. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. Just real quick, we won't get into of how they did it or how it worked itself out. But I was just been thinking about that recently. As we look at trade deals, China and how they're doing stuff, Robbin kind of broke down the backdoor policy and stuff like that. How much does China's policy, foreign and domestic, revolve around keeping those 400 million people in the middle class, not to hold them down, but just to keep them up, because that's a substantial population shift they've seen over the past 30 years. So when you're reading the headlines, is that laced through what they're doing, that there's almost a pressure from how their government works to make sure that they keep that middle class where it's at and growing?
Yeah, Ryan, I think that's a great question. And just in short, yes, I think unquestionably maintaining social stability and maintaining what the Chinese Communist Party, which rules China, would regard as its part of the social compact, which is generating increasing levels of prosperity for the people of China. That is governing principle number one, essentially, because the legitimacy of China's Communist Party and its ability to continue to rule and be seen by many in China as having, in a sense, legitimacy, not in an electoral sense, but in a sort of delivery of results sense. It rests on the party's ability to generate prosperity, to get people out of poverty, to give people increasing levels of material comfort, to give them a better life than they had, X number of years before. That is central to everything that the Chinese leadership does. And so I think there's no question that this kind of consideration is foremost in the mind of the Chinese leadership. And it's not just the 400 million that you referenced. It's with reference to the entire 1.4 billion population of China. And, you could use different definitions of middle class, but in the Chinese context, I think they would regard about probably half the country as being in that middle class. And yes, there are pockets of deep poverty, and there are a whole bunch of billionaires and very wealthy people, but there are hundreds of millions of Chinese who the Chinese would regard as being middle class. But at all ends of the socioeconomic spectrum, both ends, whether the wealthiest or the least fortunate, China wants to make sure that those folks are content with what's happening and with where they're going. and that they have confidence in where they're going, and that tomorrow is going to be a better day than today, and that their kids are going to do better than they themselves may have done. And the Chinese leadership feels that if they can deliver that, then they can stay in power indefinitely. And that's really core to the equation.
Okay, this should be easy. I'm going to go to both of you. Start with Robbin first, actually, here. Robbin and David, both of you, give me 2 to 3 resources for our listeners, besides the Energy Week podcast, of course, but if they want something that's not as good as this, but close, where should they go to find news about China, people who have kind of a good pulse of what's going on?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think Ryan, you've been publishing right now. I think in Xinhua, I thought I saw an article that you're doing. I don't think it was necessarily on China, but I would definitely say follow Ryan Ray on the different channels he's at. LinkedIn as well, very prolific on that. But if you need to get away from Ryan Ray for a second and take a look,
that's a good thing.
Yeah. I would say another place is also to plug David here real quickly. David is on the outlets on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and there's different places. And we at the Bush China Foundation have a website that right now is skeletal, but is going live with our full website here in a couple months, and we're going to be posting different content to there to help people be able to take a look at different topic matters. So we're going to sort that through the different topics in the U.S.-China relationship, whether it's energy, trade and investment, security issues. And so that's at bushchinafoundation.org. And so when that goes live, I'll definitely let you know, and we can get the word out on that. But aside from that, I would say one of the good things to do always with any geopolitical topic is to triangulate it. So take a look at headlines, of course, from the United States, the main the media that we have, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, all of these, the Houston Chronicle, and our good friend Sergio. But also take a look over at China's reporting on these things. One thing you'll see within Chinese reporting, and David can back me up on this because he's probably the one that brought this to light as we were talking about this, is that many times within Chinese reporting, the facts that they report or the things that they report are largely factual. They're largely true. The times that you talk, the thing that is different about Chinese reporting is the things they choose not to report. And so many times, if there's something that the central party does not want to be discussed or to be highlighted, they don't necessarily go and say something to the opposite. They just don't say anything on it. And so by juxtapositioning kind of what is being reported in the United States with what's being reported in China, you can learn a lot about the situation, the political cultures, and the thought of the two different nations. And then the third thing, to triangulate it, I would say, jump over to the European news sources such as the Financial Times, such as the BBC, and they have a different take on these same issues. And many times they'll cover the same issue, but to figure out what's really going on to the best of your ability, taking a look at those types of 3 different sources, U.S. mainstream media, Chinese state-run media, and the Global Times, Xinhua, People's Daily, as well as the media in coming out of Europe, like the Financial Times, the Pink Paper, as we say, or the BBC, which is also another state-run media organization, but funded by a different set of people. So that would be my recommendation. It's a lot of work, but it's very beneficial, and it helps you get a deeper understanding of what's really going on.
Yeah, and Ryan, if I could
just
very briefly just add to Robbin's comments. So a couple of things. One, I think Evan Osnos is a very good writer, very thoughtful writer on China. You see his work in the New Yorker and other publications. He's someone that I think comes at looking at China not from an ideological perspective, but trying to be true to what he sees, which I think is an increasingly rare trait in U.S. journalism these days. So that's one author in particular that often puts out some really neat analysis on China. I think Bloomberg tends to be, and there are others as well, but tends to be very good in terms of the reporting on the Chinese, U.S.-China trade and business-related issues, energy-related issues. And I think that's a good source. Economist, I think, often is pretty level-headed about China and thoughtful. But I will say, just as a broader point, I have been saddened by what I've seen in some of the major U.S. media, where there is a very strong and unmistakable ideological tint to a lot of the coverage now that we see in newspapers, for example, that used to be regarded, and I think rightly, as pretty authoritative, and now they're almost tabloid-esque when it comes to really just presenting news that is in fact nothing more than opinion, or very heavily influenced by their personal opinions or their ideological position. So I've gotten away from the U.S. mainstream media, and obviously the Chinese media has its own dynamics, and it's a very different system. And Robbin, I think, laid out some of the issues relating to how the Chinese media thinks of its role and covers stories. But leaving that topic aside, the U.S. media has become extremely ideological. Certainly major publications have. And that's why I think it's all the more important these days to be very selective and thoughtful and critical as a reader and as a consumer of information, in looking at the source and trying to gauge whether you're getting the straight story. That's something I think that didn't take as much effort 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. But in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a real deterioration in the level of objectivity of the U.S. media toward China. And that's something that causes a lot of concern. And I think it skews the debate in this country as well. So you're right to raise this question of, sources, because I think it's all the more important today to be able to identify sources that you can trust. And I think Robbin's point about looking at a multitude of, or certainly a good variety of sources to kind of reality check things, is a point that's very well taken.
Okay, you guys had a conference last year. We talked about it on the show some. I was able to attend. It was wonderful. Robbin mentioned the website, which we'll link to in the show notes. Do you guys have a event, a meet and greet, a program, a summit, conference? You're going to have the Phase 1 deal signed at your campus. What do you guys have coming on for the folks who want to learn more about you guys, follow what you're doing, and can track along as you guys continue doing the work that you started, I guess officially, was it last September?
Yes, that's right, Ryan. We started our full operations at the Bush China Foundation on September 1st of 2019. And we're really looking forward to a great first full year of full operations in 2020. We've got a number of really exciting things planned for the year. We're still finalizing some specifics of dates and so on, but I would say later on, we would love to come back on the show and lay out very specifically the dates, the venues. But just as a general preview, we're going to be involved in South by Southwest in March in Austin, and Robbin's doing a great job leading the charge on that. We're going to have some business related fora this year, possibly in the spring and definitely in the fall, that'll focus on different facets of the U.S.-China trade and economic relationship, and including in all likelihood the topic of energy, which is, as we discussed, really important. We're going to be conferring again later this year the George H.W. Bush Awards for contributions to U.S.-China relations. We'll have that award ceremony in the fall. And then there'll be a number of other things that are happening as well. But those are some of the high points. And we're just now kind of sort of finalizing some of the details of specific dates, venues, et cetera. But I think this is going to be a really exciting year. And of course, everything that we do this year is playing out against an unfolding general election campaign in this country. And so we're also staying very closely attuned to the U.S. politics of China and how candidates are talking about China and the way that China will figure in the U.S. presidential race and other races across the country. So it's going to be a busy and fun year for us. And again, it's our first full year of full operations at the Bush China Foundation, and we're growing. And doing a lot of exciting things. And I think, we're really looking forward to a great year.
Okay, that is wonderful. I do look forward to those events as I plan on defending my hackathon title whenever y'all announce. I'll get the A-team back together and we'll come back and take on newcomers. Is that how that works? We get to go back?
Absolutely, absolutely, Ryan. You got to come back and defend that title, hold that belt up over your head once again, and take all comers. But by the way, terrific job, Ryan, at the conference, and we were honored to have you there. Look forward to having you involved in so many of the events that we're doing this year.
Well, it was a pleasure. It was one of the best, probably the best conference I can think of. I told Robbin that offline. It was really well done. So look forward to more events, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your time. I know we went a little bit long. Apologize about that, and look forward to getting you back on as things develop with China. And quick prediction, if you can make predictions. I know some organizations aren't in favor of that, so if you can't, that's fine. Will Phase 2, any chance Phase 2 gets signed before the presidential election, before we vote for president this year?
Robbin, do you want to go first on that?
Absolutely not.
Yeah. Robbin, is that absolutely not about going first?
Yeah.
Or absolutely not, it will not get signed.
He won't answer that question now. Just leave it there.
I'll leave that to be interpreted.
Well said. You see, Ryan, this is why we hired Robbin. He just gets it. He uses exact right language. Ryan, here's what I think. Just very briefly, I think we are going to get to a better place in 2020. Whether that's on the U.S.-China trade issue, whether that's trade one, whether it's phase one rather, or phase one plus some additional progress, whether we will have something that's wrapped up in a pretty box and tied with a pretty bow that's called phase two, I don't know. I don't think so. And just very briefly in one sentence, the reason, 2 points. One is the reason these things aren't in phase one is because they're hard. And more fundamentally, for China to do all the things that President Trump would like China to do, China would have to change its fundamental system. And it's not going to do that. It's just not going to do it, period, because it would have far-reaching implications for the Communist Party, for the style, the system of government, and so forth and so on. So somewhere the two countries are going to meet in the middle. And where exactly that ends up is anyone's guess. It hopefully will end up at a place that is a better status quo, a higher quality status quo than what we have presently. Phase one, so-called phase one, may be a part of that. There may be additional progress that's made. But if you're saying, do I think there will be some sort of a signing ceremony for a phase two per se? No, I don't think so. But I think we're going to continue to muddle through and get to a better place because the political and economic imperatives on both sides demand that. And it leads to the last point I want to make, which is, people sometimes ask me, why didn't these trade problems get resolved under any other previous president, Republican or Democrat? And I said, well, in my judgment, I often say to folks, in my judgment, the reason they didn't get solved is because no previous president, Republican or Democrat, could think of a solution that wasn't worse than the problem. And I think what President Trump has done is he's found a solution, but the problem is that the solution is worse than the original problem. And that's why we have a larger deficit with China. It's why we have a larger deficit with the world. It's why American families are paying more every year for the same things that cost less last year. It's why we've lost manufacturing jobs, and it's why we're losing our agricultural surplus. All of those are hard data points that are irrefutable. I'd like to see us go in a different direction, but sometimes the realization that the solution that a person has in mind is actually worse than the problem is the greatest wisdom you can apply to the problem, and that's probably why this thing didn't get solved earlier. Nevertheless, this is where we are, and all of us want to see the United States succeed and want to see our country's producers, whether they're shareholders, whether they're workers, whether they're farmers or ranchers like Robbin is, we want to see those folks succeed, and hopefully the two sides will find a way to do that.
Okay, well, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on. I know you are both super busy, so I appreciate the time. And to both countries, I am offering my services right now for a steep fee to help get this thing wrapped up by the election or whenever. We can drag it on. It's just whatever. I'll be happy to get that done, and look forward to defending my belt with the A-team at the next conference. It was good to have you on. Listeners, it was good to be back, and we will talk to you next week.